Hello guys, good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us once again. This session is GCSE History session. It's going to be focused on life in Elizabethan England. It's going to be delivered by the amazing Yasmin. Yasmin, as some of you already know, is currently studying international relations and modern history at the University of St Andrews. And it really sounds like we're in for a treat. For new joiners, just to let you know that this session will go on for an hour, so that means we're going to end around 4:15. If you have any questions throughout the session at any point, do put it in the chat or within the Q&A function. Both are located at the bottom of your screen, so you can just pop them there. Right, if you're ready, Yasmin, I'm going to pass it over to you now.
Brilliant. So thank you for that introduction. As we just said, today we're doing life in Elizabethan England. But before we get stuck into that, we're just going to go through a quick summary of what we did last lesson, which was challenges to Elizabeth's reign. So Elizabeth became queen in 1558 following the death of Mary Tudor. She was faced with issues of legitimacy and concerns about her unmarried status. Elizabeth proved to be a charismatic and intellectual leader. She was very highly educated and she could speak 6 languages. The Queen, advised by the Privy Council, was very powerful, although she could not pass laws or raise taxes without Parliament's permission. England had a population of around 2.8 million, roughly 10% lived in towns and cities, and 90% lived in the countryside. Elizabeth inherited a country that was £300,000 in debt. Over her reign, she sold off crown lands and reduced her expenses to pay off the debt. And tensions between England and France were high at the beginning of her reign. She officially surrendered Calais to France to avoid war, and then the tensions increased with Spain as opposed to France. So that should have just been a quick sort of refresh. And so for everyone who was here last lesson, hopefully you know all that. For everyone who's just joined us this session, then that's a little summary. The other ones can be found on the My Tutor YouTube page, I believe. So today we're looking at life in Elizabethan England. We're going to be focusing on 3 main areas of life under Elizabeth. They are education, leisure and poverty. So first up is education. Education under Elizabeth had no national system of education. Like, there wasn't a national curriculum, there wasn't a national set of schools. The purpose of education was to help people prepare for their expected roles in life. So it focused on practical skills and sometimes basic literacy. The growth rate of trade and Protestantism meant that more people were understand mathematics, to record transactions as part of trade, and also to read scripture as part of Protestantism. Just had a question. So as a whole, Elizabeth I was an efficient ruler. That is up to you. That is something that you can talk about in all of your exam questions, all of your essay questions. So I'm going to leave that up to you. Hopefully you're drawing your own conclusions, but that is a really good point for you to all be thinking about throughout the whole Elizabeth course, really. So, institutions. Private tutors and petty schools were set up in people's homes. Petty schools were for children up to the age of 10. Parish schools were for children up to the age of 10, and they were set up locally by the church and run by the clergy. They taught basic literacy to the children of yeoman farmers and also to craftsmen. So both private tutors and petty schools and parish schools teach children up to the age of 10, that's boys and girls, up to the age of 10. But the difference is that private tutors and petty schools were just for the wealthy and they were done in their own homes. So you had to be able to afford to do it privately, and parish schools were run by the church and they were for poorer children. So everyone up to the age of 10, more or less, is getting a basic education. Then you get grammar schools, which were for boys aged 10 to 14, and they provided an education independently of the church. So they were attended by children of the gentry, merchants, yeoman farmers and craftsmen, and they are independent of the church. Finally, you've got universities, which were for boys aged 14 and upwards. They taught geometry, music, astronomy, philosophy, logic and rhetoric, which is basically speaking used in law, medicine, law and divinity. There were 2 universities in England at the time, Oxford and Cambridge. Was education free? Parish schools might have had donations, but to attend was free on the whole. For or for petty schools, that was obviously set up by the parents, and so they were paying for the private tutors. And the clergy are sort of the, I don't know how to say it, sort of the people in the church, so priests, bishops, cardinals, things like that. They're all part of the clergy. It's religious men, really, whose work is in the church. Someone's just asked, what about the girls? Well, girls were not given an education past the age of 10. We've actually got a discussion point on that later on, so save up all of your points for that. Excellent. So how did education change under Elizabeth? New grammar schools meant children were now educated independently from the church. Scholarships allowed people from poorer backgrounds to receive an education. The growth of the printing press meant that books were less expensive and more readily available. So this gives more people the opportunity to read, whether they're in school or out of school. A branch of philosophy gained popularity in the 1500s. This was as a result of the Renaissance and the Reformation of the church, and it argued that education was valuable and should not just be a way of preparing people for their expected role in life. Everyone should be given a chance to be educated, and education was more important than just preparing you to be a market trader or something like that. It should be to sort of engage your brain a bit more. Literacy improved, especially in the towns. This was the combined result of the printing press, parish schools, and the need to read scriptures. So Protestantism encouraged literacy so that individuals could read the Bible themselves and make their own interpretations and conclusions about what it's saying, instead of just relying on the clergy to dictate the meaning of the Bible. So it's allowing people, if you're able to read, you're allowed more sort of scope in your own religious beliefs and you can come to your own conclusions. It's less hierarchical and authoritarian. And then girls and the lower classes were not given a formal education. So, quiz question. Who was taught in parish schools? Who was taught in parish schools? What age were they? And what class would the children have been in parish schools? Who was taught in parish schools? Okay, we've had a question. Being a female, why did Elizabeth I keep a blind eye to the lack of education for women? Say what sort of sources you look at and things like that. On the whole, it's probably because society generally didn't think that women should be educated, so she didn't want to push through something that wasn't going to be popular. Also, Elizabeth can't make any laws without the consent of Parliament, which is mainly men. In fact, it was entirely men, and not a lot of men wanted to educate women, so that was a big factor. And yeah, it's all sort of quite hazy, but generally because she couldn't get it through Parliament would be one of the main things, because society wasn't really very happy about educating girls at this time. Excellent. So we've got some answers here. Some of you are right, so well done. If you didn't get this right, don't worry, just make a note of it. It's a bit confusing. So who was taught in parish schools? Children up to the age of 10 and children of yeomen, farmers and craftsmen. So some of you have said lower classes, which is excellent. Yeah, perfect. So well done if you got that right. So this is our discussion point. Do you think it was fair that girls and lower classes were not given a formal education? So take a moment to think about that, what you think, and then into the chat what you think. Do you think it was fair that girls and lower classes were not given a formal education? And then while you're thinking about that, do you think it was fair looking back? And do you think it was fair if you were an Elizabethan yourself? So do you think that the perception would change between how we look at it and how an Elizabethan would have seen it. So I'll just give you a couple of seconds now just to get your answers in. Do you think it was fair that girls and lower classes were not given a formal education? Has anyone got any opinions on this? Excellent. So Ella said, I don't think it is fair as everyone deserves a formal education. Excellent point there, Ella. Millie said, it is not fair and it is wrong. I believe that women should go to school because if they wanted a job, they needed to be educated. I'm a feminist. Good for you, Millie. Helen, it wasn't fair for girls to be treated in that way because they are people. Millie, I believe that everyone is the same. Excellent. Siege. No, as women could have revolutionary ideas. Excellent point. Ella, if everyone got a formal education, more people would help out with jobs and make more money. Yes, excellent. Most of England were peasants and it would bring her popularity among them. Excellent. These are all really good points. Everyone should be treated equally. Yeah, that's a key point. Excellent. So, yes, I'm glad that we've got a group of feminists here. Do you think it was good? Yes. So most of you have answered that you think everyone should be treated equally, which is an excellent point. In terms of how an Elizabethan would think about it, though, women were expected to marry and then have children. So they weren't expected to run businesses or go into any sort of professions. So in that sense, they didn't really need a formal education beyond being able to sign their name on to sign their marriage, or for debts, or for wills, or any legal sort of contract or paper. Women didn't really need to be literate and they didn't really need any understanding of maths. So in that sense, for a lot of Elizabethans, they wouldn't have seen the point in educating women. But as you've all said, there are some pluses to educating women. So can you think of any examples of people in Elizabethan society who were female or from the lower classes who had an education? Can you think of any examples? Another point just to make as well about the previous discussion point is that the lower classes also were going to be in professions where they were either working on farms or they were sort of doing a lot of manual labour, so they didn't need to use literacy or numeracy beyond, you know, being able to count the number of eggs or sell something at the market or sign their name for deeds and stuff like that. So on the whole, a lot of girls and lower classes didn't actually need to be educated to get by in life. But you've all raised excellent points about equality. So some of you have put in your answers about any examples of people you can think of in Elizabethan society who had an education. So far we've had Queen Elizabeth I, excellent. She was very highly educated. This is probably because she was going to be a future monarch. You don't want an uneducated person on the throne. That doesn't look good on your country, on the sort of international stage, to have someone who's literate, and also being able to make a point succinctly and persuasively through her study of rhetoric would mean that she's a good speech maker. She's able to make her arguments in Parliament, which is going to be good for her. Then you've got Ella said daughters of rich families. Excellent. So girls were taught privately in some cases. It depends which family they came from. That's sort of more subjective, but yep, excellent. Mary Queen of Scots, yep, excellent. Millie said Shakespeare wasn't educated. Yes, there's a lot of contention about this actually. There's two camps of thought really on Shakespeare. Some people say that he was uneducated and he was illiterate, and then some people say that he was educated. Some schools around where he was born have claimed that he studied there. So Shakespeare's a little bit more elusive, but if we take him as the man that we've sort of been taught about, then he wrote a series of plays, so obviously he could write. Excellent. And yes, men in Parliament, good job. So the main two examples that I was thinking of were Elizabeth I, so the Queen, and also Shakespeare. Whether or not Shakespeare actually wrote the plays is a different issue, but let's say that he did, and in that case, yes, he could read and write at least. So good job, guys. Now we will be moving on to leisure. So Elizabethan leisure. There were large numbers of leisure pursuits in Elizabethan England. These were based on your social class. So the leisure pursuits of the nobles included hunting, bowls, fishing, fencing, and tennis. And of farmers, craftsmen, and the lower classes, baiting, cockfighting, football, and wrestling. Cockfighting and baiting were spectator sports, so people would make bets and gamble on the outcome of fights between animals such as cockerels, bears, and dogs. Obviously, there were no animal cruelty organisations that had a massive influence in these days, so that's why that would have been allowed in the same way that it's not now. But most of the leisure activities of the lower classes were things that didn't need a lot of equipment, they didn't need a lot of money, you were just gambling what you had instead of having to, you know, buy fencing gear or get horses and stable them. It's a lot more things that are readily available compared to the nobles, and that causes quite a big distinction between nobles and the lower classes in Elizabethan society in what they're doing in their leisure time. But one thing that united all classes of Elizabethan society was the theatre. So, Elizabethan theatre, it became more and more popular throughout the period. Plays were written by playwrights such as William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, and John Fletcher, and they were shown in purpose-built theatres such as the Red Lion, the Globe, and the Rose. The wealthy sponsored teams of professional players, so they're actors. Sponsors included the Queen and the Earl of Leicester, and their performers were known as the Queen's Men or Leicester's Men, respectively. All social classes attended the theatre, so purpose-built theatres had to be built to accommodate growing audiences as more people were coming in the theatre. And I don't know if any of you have seen the Globe or a layout of the Globe. Way that it's laid out is so that all of the social classes can remain separate. So for the Globe, for example, you've got the base layer, the standing sort of section, and that's for the lower classes. And then as you go up the tiers, there's 3 tiers. As you go up them, you're getting richer and richer, basically. So even though everyone attends plays, there is still sort of social all of the classes. So that's theatre. And then music. So music and dancing were popular pastimes. Popular instruments included lutes, spinets, and harpsichords. Wealthy families employed musicians to play during meals and feasts, and music was often played during plays in the theatre, and musicians were often on a balcony above the stage or on the stage with the players, and sometimes you got players who were actually playing instruments themselves. So it was very key to theatre, basically. Excellent. So I have another quiz question for you all. Who would have played football? Who would have played football? The nobles or the lower classes? So excellent. You've got some answers coming here. Good stuff. So who would have played football? You've got to think this is quite a cheap sport. You only need a ball or anything you can kick about, really. There's not much equipment. Excellent. So most of you have gone for, well, all of you actually have gone for the lower classes, which was the correct answer. You would not have found many nobles playing football. They would have been hunting or fencing. Excellent. So farmers, craftsmen, and the lower classes. Good job if you got that right. And if you didn't, jot it down because that's a good example. So that's Elizabethan leisure. Moving on now to poverty. So there were many reasons why poverty and vagabondage increased in Elizabethan England, including population growth, bad harvests, and closure. So let's look in more depth now at the reasons for poverty in Elizabethan England. The population of England grew from 2.8 million to 4.2 million over 10 years. So the first 10 years of Elizabeth's reign. That's a really good statistic, so jot that one down. It's excellent for evidence in exam answers. This in turn increased the demand for food, which drives up the prices, while increased labour supply drove down the wages. So this meant that ordinary people could no longer provide for their family as food was too expensive, but wages were too low. So that's your first issue. The second issue is that increasing population also meant more people needed land. So this drove up rents and resulted in entry fees, which are upfront sums paid at the start of a land rental, and many people could not afford to pay these. Either they couldn't afford the rent or they couldn't afford the entry fee. So that's causing a lot of issues for people who can no longer gain access to land for farming, etc., just living generally. Also, the growth of towns such as London drove up the costs of rent and food prices, as food now had to be brought in from rural areas because you've got more people to feed. Land was divided into fields for animal husbandry or arable farming, and they were given to farmers who farmed for profit. So not just farmers who were farming to feed themselves and their family, but those who were farming to then sell what they've produced. And this was called enclosure, and it denied people use of common land, which meant that they were unable to provide for their own families because they've got no common land to grow their own food. It's all been enclosed. And finally, bad harvests in 1562, 1565, 1573 and 1586 hit subsistence farmers and reduced the food supply, driving up prices. Jot down those dates because they're important for later on in the lesson, and also they're excellent bits of detail to add in to exam answers. So all in all, population growth has a lot to answer for during the Elizabethan period, but we've got the issue of poverty. What was poverty? This sounds quite philosophical, but basically definitions and perceptions of poverty change continuously throughout history. So we're just going to have a quick look at what poverty was during Elizabeth's reign. How would you define poverty during Elizabeth's reign? So poverty was spending more than 80% of your income on bread, being unemployed or ill, so you could no longer provide for yourself or your family, being unable to afford the rising cost of food, and needing financial help, poor relief or charity alms. So there are four main, if you don't already know them, because they're really important. And a final thing to know really about poverty is that vagrants were slightly different to people in poverty. So vagrants were people without settled home or regular work, and many vagrants were also seen as vagabonds, which were idle and dishonest people who wandered from place to place committing crimes. The main difference is that vagrants go around committing crimes and they don't have a settled work or home, and people in poverty are working, they just can't afford rents, food, stuff like that. So that's the main difference. Excellent. So we've got another quiz question. In what years were the bad harvests? In what years were the bad harvests? There's 4 of them, just as a quick clue there. And like I said earlier, if you know these are just going to put you in excellent stead for the exams because they're really good dates. It shows that you really know your stuff. You've got 3, 4 even specific dates. Also, not many people talk about bad harvests in exam questions. So if you're able to put this in and have a good solid answer, then that's going to boost you in the examiner's eyes. So excellent. A lot of you have got the answer right. Excellent. So it was 1562, 1565, 1573 and 1586. If you didn't get these down before, get them down now because they're really important. So that's poverty, sort of a bit of a background there. So what were the changing attitudes during the Elizabethan time? Well, the Elizabethan government worried that the growing number of people in poverty would lead to disorder and rebellion, and this led to change in policy towards the poor and the introduction of the Vagabonds Act in 1572 and the Poor Relief Act in 1576. So the attitude towards the poor changed during the Elizabethan times for a number of reasons. So the increase in population and enclosure of farmland meant that there was an increasingly visible presence of people living in poverty. So they were seen on the streets more, they weren't just sort of hurried away, they were more visible. The government worried that poverty might lead to disorder and rebellion, and Elizabeth's whole reign is plagued by disorder and rebellion, so she wants to cut it out wherever possible. The cost of dealing with the poor, particularly the poor rates and charitable causes, meant that wealthier members of society contributed to dealing with poverty. The government couldn't deal with it on their own. They needed charity and poor rates and stuff like that to help. So they're calling on the wealthy people to help out as well. So many Elizabethans distinguished between the deserving poor or impotent poor, which were the old and the sick, who could not help themselves, and the idle poor, so those who could work but chose not to do so. And this was a very important distinction for Elizabethans, because they would help the deserving poor but not help the idle poor. So it was felt that the poor should be given every opportunity to better themselves, but those who refuse to do so should be punished. And there's a multiple few ways that they're able to do this, and they don't do it to everyone. It's just the idle poor, so people who are not actively helping themselves, just sort of living off the state and on handouts, and that's who Elizabethans didn't feel needed help. So you have the Vagabonds Act in 1572. Parliament felt that vagrants posed a threat to public order and they had to be deterred through punishment. So people accused of vagrancy were whipped and had holes drilled through each ear as a mark of shame and to warn others of their vagrancy. So that's quite an obvious thing, obviously, so that everyone can see that you're a vagrant. Then that's on your first strike. The second is you're imprisoned if you're arrested again for vagrancy, and you were given the death penalty for a third offence. So this seems quite extreme, quite intense, but the Act also introduced a national poor rate to provide support for the impotent poor, so that's the old and the sick, and justices of the peace had to keep a register of the poor, and then local government was tasked with finding work for the able-bodied poor. So you don't have, they're not completely left on their own. Even though the Vagabonds Act is quite harsh, it does also help out with the issue of the poor. It's not just punishing them. So that's the Vagabonds Act. Then you've also got the Poor Relief Act, which was in 1576. So JPs were required to provide the poor with wool and raw materials, which would enable them to make and sell things. So if they're given these raw materials, they thought that they would then make stuff, be able to sell that, and then that's sort of giving them a leg up so that they can start providing for themselves. And the poor who refused to do so were sent to a special prison as a house of correction. So they're just trying to encourage them through sort of punishment, I guess, to look out for themselves. But it's also a way to get them off the streets, to get them, to prevent them, you know, resorting to stealing and stuff like that. So that's one of the things that they do. So it's sort of the carrot and the stick situation where we'll help you out, but if you then don't help yourself, you are going to be punished, because, as I said before, poverty was a big issue and the Elizabethans wanted to sort it out. So, quiz question: can you name the two acts introduced to reduce poverty? Can you name the two acts introduced to reduce poverty? Extra points if you can tell me what years they were in. So, can you name the two acts introduced to reduce poverty and what year they were in? If you can get these into exam questions, it just looks really good to the examiner. It's quite a specific piece of knowledge, especially if you know what each act does. And it's a good piece of evidence really to support any point that you're making about poverty or dealing with the poor during Elizabethan times. So you've had a few seconds there to get your answers in. If you didn't manage to do that, don't worry. If you didn't know, also don't worry. So the answer was the Vagabonds Act 1572 and the Poor Relief Act in 1576. So if you didn't get that, jot that down now because they are really important. They're basically the only two pieces of legislation you need to know for this topic, and they're quite important ones. So make sure you write them down because yeah, they're just excellent for exam questions. So a quick summary of everything that we have done today. More people were taught reading and mathematics thanks to the growth of trade, Protestantism and the printing press. More grammar schools opened to teach children from wealthy families. More people went to university during this period. Elizabethan upper and lower classes had different pastimes and they rarely mixed, except at the theatre. Theatre grew during the Elizabethan period, giving rise to playwrights like William Shakespeare. Population growth drove up rent, food prices, and decreased wages. Bad harvests and enclosed land meant that less food was grown and it was more expensive, and as a result, more and more people fell into poverty. The Elizabethan government were concerned about poverty and they were concerned about it leading to disorder and rebellion, and so they introduced the 1572 Vagabonds Act, which punished vagrants and introduced a national poor rate, and the 1576 Poor Relief Act, which was designed to give the poor a way to make money. So that's just a quick summary, hopefully just brings it all together. So now we're going to have a look at some exam questions. So for the life in Elizabethan topic, it is likely that you will get questions based on the poor law, leisure or education. Make sure that you revise the whole topic, but if you know those three areas really well, then you should be able to answer most questions on Elizabethan life. And if you could get any question, so it's quite broad again, so you could get a 4 marker, a 12 marker, or a 16 marker. Excellent. So this is the question that we're going to be looking at today. It's a 12-mark question. Explain why there was an increase in poverty in early Elizabethan England. You may use the following in your answer: inflation and the wool industry. You must also use information of your own. So what I would like you to do is to think of another cause of poverty to include in this question. Then I would like you to write a quick answer to the question using your additional cause. Explain your cause, use some evidence, and link it back to the question. So to do well in these questions, you need to use PEAL, which is point, explanation, evidence, link. You need to do that for each one of your points. So you should have 3 points overall, and for each one of your points, you need to PEAL. You need to point, explanation, evidence, link. So I've just had a question: what does inflation mean? Basically, it's part of economics. It's quite tricky if you actually get into it, but the sort of general gist is that prices increase. That's basically it. It's just prices become inflated. I'll try and find an actual proper definition of it, because I don't think I'm going to explain this very well. But it is, okay, so it is a quantitative measure of the rate at which the average price level of a basket of selected goods and services in an economy increases over some period of time. So basically, how much are prices rising? So when it talks about inflation, it's talking about rising prices. So explain why there was an increase in poverty in early Elizabethan England. When you're talking about inflation, you would talk about the fact that food prices, rents, rent for lands is all increasing. So inflation is rising prices, increasing prices. I hope that sort of clears it up a bit. But inflation is basically just rising prices. So hopefully that covers that. What I want you all to do now is to think of another cause of poverty to include in this question. So what would your additional point be? And I want you to have a go at writing a quick explanation using some evidence and then linking it back to the question. So I'm just going to give you a bit of time now to write that and then put it into the chat. so that I can read through them. We can have a little look at them together. So you're thinking of another cause of poverty to include in this question, then write a quick answer to it, explaining it, using some evidence, and linking it back to the question. So the question is just on the screen. So for a 12 marker, you don't need to come to a judgment. So you don't need to evaluate, you just analyse and explain it using your subject knowledge. To get a level 4, which is the highest level, so that's 10 to 12 marks on a question, you absolutely must include an additional point, which is why I'm getting you all to write little paragraphs now on it, because without that you can't get into level 4. So the highest mark that you can get is a 9 out of 12. I'm sure you all want to do better than that. So you absolutely must, that's why they put it in bold, include another point from your own knowledge, and remembering to include a third point is the easiest way to get into level 4, to get into the top band, to do well in these questions, really. So hopefully we'll start seeing some of your answers trickle through soon. You don't need to go into depth, just sort of give me your point, your explanation, your evidence, and your link. So we've got an answer here. Thank you very much. I will just put these into the lesson space. I won't name you all. You can remain. So this is the first student's answer. We've got a few more. So what we're going to do is, sorry guys, you've accidentally signed yourselves up for a peer marking. So first answer, there were many factors that affected the poverty of England. This is due to the population rising from 2.8 million to 4.2 million. This has led to more people living in England, leading more labour rates and higher rates. This has led many people to become destitute, unable to pay high rents and food from their meagre wage. This, therefore, is a major factor affecting the poverty rate. So this is a really good answer. Actually, first of all, you've got your point, which is increases in population. Excellent. Then you've explained that it leads to more people looking for work, so that increases the amount of people looking for work, and also this leads to higher rates, and then unable to pay their high rents and food because they've got a less wage. And you've linked it back to the question, so that's a really good answer. That you could have improved this is to put in when the population increased. So over the first 10 years of Elizabeth's reign, just for extra, sorry, I'm not a very good speller, sort of clarity in the point that you're trying to make there, that just sort of elevates your evidence. But otherwise, that's a really good answer. Well done. The second answer, bad harvests, excellent point to include, caused an increase in poverty as there was less food for people, which caused food prices to increase as there was limited food. Excellent. There were 4 main bad harvests throughout Elizabeth's reign, which shows how much prices raised and how desperate people would have been to try and afford the food prices. Excellent. As many can afford the high prices, poverty increased. Excellent. Excellent. It's a really good answer. The only way that you could have improved this is, again, this is about using specific examples. So you could have included the dates of the bad harvests. I know I didn't give you very much time to write your answers, but just including those dates would have elevated your answer. It was a really good answer anyway, but just including them would have made it even better. So well done to both of you. Those are really good answers. You've both made a point, you've explained it, used a bit of evidence, and linked it back to the question. So well done, guys. And well done for inadvertently volunteering yourselves. So hopefully that sort of clears up the way that you can look at a question like this. But those aren't the only things that you could have said. So, of course, my PowerPoint's not going to work now. Excellent. So other things that you could have included were the coinage was debased. We haven't actually gone through this today, but we did go through this in the first 2 lessons. So when a coinage is debased, it basically means that the amount of silver and gold in each individual coin was reduced, which reduces its worth, which leads to rising prices, because whereas a £1 used to be worth £1, it's now, because you've taken out the gold and the silver, it's worth less than that, but you're still paying with £1. There's a bit of very complex economics behind there, but basically if you reduce the silver and gold content of the actual coins, it causes inflation and prices rise. So that was another thing that you could have included. Poor harvests, excellent. It's one of the students included, and population increases, which is what the other student included. So excellent, good job guys. If you didn't have those points, jot them down now because they're really good. This is a sort of staple Elizabethan England question. So if you'd answer these, you're going to be in a good place for the exam. So, revision tips. These are the same in basically every lesson because overall the way that you're revising should be good. Sort of the same across it all. So make a cheat sheet with all of the key dates, names, facts and figures. This is important for this topic because you've got names like William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe. You've also got figures like the population increases and dates like the dates of the poor harvest. So really make sure that you get all of them down, put them somewhere that you're going to see it every day. So on front of your wardrobe, wherever you keep your shoes as you're going out the door, places like that so you can see them all the time. Make bubble maps or notes, however you've best revised for the following topics. So education, poverty and leisure, and practice using past paper questions. This is probably the hardest way to revise because it takes a lot more brain power and you have to sit down and actually do it, but it is the absolute best way to prepare yourself for the exam because you really get to grips with how the questions work, and also you become more comfortable when you come into the exam. If you do basically every past paper question there is, then chances are you're going to get one that's quite similar in the exam. So you're just giving yourself the best possible chance really by doing all of the past paper questions. So final thing, we've got a quiz. So this has got 5 questions. The first question, who could go to university? Who could go to university? It's the first quiz question. If you'd all just put your answers in. Excellent. Who could go to university? So, good stuff. The answer was boys over the age of 14. Some of you have gone for even better answers and you've said that it was higher class boys, which was excellent. So boys over the age of 14. Now give one reason for increased literacy. One reason for increased literacy. Why did literacy increase during the Elizabethan period? Any of you think of anything? Excellent. Got some answers trickling in now. So one reason for increased literacy. So why do people need to read and write more? Okay, this is a harder question, so don't worry if you didn't get it, but just make a note of it now. So you've got Protestantism, the printing press, and parish schools. So Protestantism, people had to learn to read the Bible so that they could make their own interpretations. The printing press, if you ever, any of you go on to study history, this is like the defining point of modern history. The printing press, it just makes everything more readily available to read because you're not handwriting it all the time. And parish schools, which meant that more children had access to education. So next question, who could go to the theatre? Who could go to the theatre? Excellent, got some answers coming in. Who could go to the theatre? Was it limited to anyone? Who could go to the theatre? Okay, excellent. So we've got some good answers coming in here. So anyone could go to the theatre. All classes enjoyed theatre going. It becomes a real sort of communal activity. So while anyone could go, they were still separated into their classes. So you wouldn't have the upper classes mixing with the lower classes, but everyone could go and see the same play in the same theatre. Excellent. So what was the increase in population over the first 10 years of Elizabeth's reign? What was the increase in population over the first 10 years of Elizabeth's reign? Remember, if you're ever using this statistic, it's a really good one, so try and get it into any questions where it's relevant. Remember to specify that it increases by this much in the first 10 years, because that really just gives you the sort of clarity that you need to do well in one of these answers. Excellent. So the answer for this one was 2.8 million to 4.2 million. Excellent. So if you got that, well done. If you didn't, jot it down because it's a really good statistic. And the final question, what year was the Poor Relief Act? What year was the Poor Relief Act? So this is one of the 2 acts introduced to deal with poverty. What year was the Poor Relief Act? So, yeah, all of you have got it right so far. The Poor Relief Act was introduced in 1576, and the Vagrancy Act, or Vagabonds Act, I can't remember. So the Vagabonds Act even was in 1572, so that's the other one, that's the other sort of twin to the Poor Relief Act. So well done to everyone if you got those right. If you didn't, don't worry, just jot it down now because they're all really good sort of fact bites of information that you can use in your exams, and they'll be really good for helping you revise as well. So that's everything from me today. Are there any questions on this topic? Are there any questions on life in Elizabethan England? What does JP stand for? Justices of the Peace. Sorry, I probably should have made that clearer. It's something that comes up quite a lot in other topics, so my students are familiar with it from there. But yes, JPs stands for Justice of the Peace. And these were quite wealthy men, and they were in charge of law and order in a particular county or their particular region. So they've got quite a lot of power, but they're Justices of the Peace. Any other questions at all? Any other questions about the Elizabeth topic generally? We've got one, did she Industrial Revolution? No, the Industrial Revolution came a couple of centuries afterwards. So no, she didn't. When did the globe burn down? I actually don't know off the top of my head. I think it burnt down 3 times actually. So quite a lot. It was rebuilt quite recently in the 90s, I think, the 1990s. So it's been burnt down a couple of times. But I will just have a look for you. Get that. How did Shakespeare die? Syphilis, I believe. Okay, so the first time that the globe burned down was in 1613. So after Elizabeth dies, she dies in 1601. So 12 years after she dies is the first time that the globe burns down. So it's good to know for general knowledge, but it won't be relevant for this course, so you don't have to worry about that. Excellent. So are there any, okay, what were the approx marks for the answers? So you've got a 4-mark answer, you've got a 12-mark answer, and you've got the 60-mark answers. And for each sort of point in a 12-mark answer, which is I think what you were getting at there, you should be getting about 4 marks. So the way that I would break that down is mark for your point, mark for your explanation, mark for your evidence, and mark for your link. It's not as standard as that. They look at your whole answer and then grade it. But if you're putting in all of those things for each one, then you're going to be in the top band, which is where you want to be, obviously. And who came after Queen Elizabeth? Okay, so after Queen Elizabeth, you get Mary Queen of Scots. So Elizabeth dies, and then James the 1st and 6th becomes king. So he is Mary Queen of Scots' son, and he is James the 6th of Scotland. And then when Elizabeth dies, he becomes James the 1st of England, as well as James the 6th of Scotland. Excellent. Any other questions at all? Okay, excellent. So I think that we will leave it there today. You're all very welcome for the lesson. Thank you all for interacting. And I'm glad to hear that you've learned a lot. So if you missed anything, you can watch it back on the YouTube page. And if you tune in next week, we should be doing the Spanish Armada, hopefully. So got that to look forward to. Excellent.
Amazing. Thank you, Yaz. Have a lovely afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.